Most people have spent a night or a weekend camping, listening to the wind blowing through the trees, leaves rustling on the ground, twigs snapping. Maybe it was just nothing, just nature and animals. Or maybe it was something else. The following stories are all instances of something different. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the fear. Number one. I had just arranged a nice weekend of camping with my son, Alexander. He had always wanted to join me in one of my camping trips, but his mother wouldn't let him join me, making it quite obvious that she thinks I don't deserve Alexander. I was actually excited at the fact he would join me this time. I had checked what the place was like online, and it seemed quite secluded, but obviously quite beautiful with some stunning views and a nearby lake. I had asked a couple of my friends if they had ever been there, and both said no, which surprised me as usually they have at least heard of the place. I had just packed a few bags with camping essentials like food, water, sleeping bags, and a large tent. Then Alexander's mother, Alice, called me. We were on better terms than we used to be, but we were nowhere near being back together. Alice informed me that Alexander had got a bad cold, meaning he couldn't join me. I had been so excited just to be let down, but that didn't matter now. I just thanked her for letting me know and got in my car. About halfway there, I realized that I would be truly alone in a place that I've never been, but that wouldn't stop me from going there. The trees around me at that point in my journey were huge. I couldn't see the top of most of them. I had been driving for about 2 hours now and decided to pull over to the side of the road for a while. I had needed to go to the toilet for a while beforehand, but there was nowhere to stop until that point. Then I got in my car and set off again. I had made it around 5:40. It was a dense woodland area with streams and cliffs everywhere. I had decided to go to sleep early that night as the drive tired me out. The gentle rustling of animals in the trees and bushes helped me drift off into a fairly uninterrupted sleep. A loud crashing noise startled me awake. I checked my watch. It was 4:10 in the morning. I crawled out of my tent to see a tree had fallen and was sliding down the cliff, which was extremely weird as this tree was very tall and to fall that hard something must have hit it with some force. There was a lurch in my stomach and then I realized a car may have hit it. I sprinted into the road over to the base of the tree and saw something odd. There was no car, so I was no longer panicked, but the tree hadn't just fallen, it had been scratched multiple times. Being a biologist, the marks were like nothing I'd ever seen before. I had decided to investigate this unnatural occurrence, as I was curious to see what had done that kind of damage to a tree that size. I set into the deep woodland with the sole purpose of finding the mysterious creature that knocked down the tree. I then, maybe an hour later, stumbled across a carcass. The body belonged to a bear, known for being this region's apex predator. It had a bite mark on its side that, on closer inspection, was revealed to be that of a fox that had some of the scraps from whatever killed the bear. I searched for a few hours more and got hungry. I sat on a tree stump and ate some granola bars. During this, I heard a guttural roar that reverberated through the trees. I ran towards the noise's origins when I heard the second roar. This one shook me to the core. Afraid but determined, I continued towards the area it had come from, and I was utterly confused to what kind of creature had that kind of cry. I made it to the edge of the lake and stopped for a moment. The running had really made me tired, so I needed to take a break. After half an hour, I decided to leave only to hear it roar again. The roar was in the trees behind me. I darted to my feet and stood, watched the trees cautiously. I always carried a camping knife just in case I was attacked by a wolf or something like that. I heard the creature breathing and heard its very powerful footsteps. I was ready to leave the area at this point. I walked towards the clearing when suddenly the beast leapt in front of me, causing me to recoil in terror. The creature was large and had jet black fur. It slowly lifted its head to stare at me with its evil red eyes. It stood on its hind legs and its hot breath enveloped me. It let out another blood-curdling screech. I was shaking while staring at this unknown creature that stood about 7 feet tall. I was totally paralyzed in fear until the beast took a heavy step towards me. Running now, I was focused on not being the creature's next meal. I heard its slow walking speed up behind me until it reached the sprint that shook the ground. It leapt at me, so I dove to my left and out of its path. I slashed weakly into its flank as it was down. It snarled at me and stood up again. I ran as fast as I could. I had decided to leave the tent, sleeping bags, and everything behind because they would only slow me down. I reached a clearing and didn't stop until I got to the car. I started driving fast, and behind me I saw the creature slip back into the woods with a huge roar. In the end, I was glad Alexander didn't come too, as we probably wouldn't have made it out alive, and since then I haven't gone camping again. Number 2. The story is true, so I'd appreciate it if you would not make fun of what happened to us. Thank you. For some background, I'm 19 years old, and I'm currently living in northern England, and it was about 7 months ago when me and my mates decided to do some overnight camping in the middle of the massive woods, just 1.5 miles away from where we all lived. It was me and three others. I'll call them Marcus, Logan, and Jack for the sake of the story. We packed up the stuff we needed to get through that day and parts of the day after. When we got to the campgrounds, Logan pointed out that there was about two tents 70 meters from where we were. There wasn't anything different about them, we just thought they were camping just like us. Nightfall. Then night came upon us, so we decided to gather some nearby firewood to build a fire so we could cook dinner and for general heat. I saw that Marcus's head kept on turning back slightly as if he were paranoid, and Jack would call him out and make fun of him. But I knew that something was wrong, so I pulled him aside and asked him what was wrong. He replied, "I think we're being watched or listened to, I don't know." His voice was quivering. I asked, "What? How do you know for sure?" Marcus pointed to the tree line where we set up camp. I have to admit that gave me shivers, but in the light of the fire, there was someone just visible poking from behind a tree. But I think he noticed because he slowly moved backwards out of sight. Now I bet you're thinking, why didn't we shout, "Why don't you just leave?" Well, because we thought we could take on one guy. Staying in a big group sort of thing. We were ignorant for thinking that. So after a few more beers, the guy standing behind the trees seemed like a distant memory. Then it came to the point where we were all asleep, and then out of nowhere, my tent zipped open on three 6 foot plus men were getting ready to attack me. So, like any man would do, I screamed my ass off. Obviously, my friends heard because I saw Jack, Logan, and Marcus come up behind and tackle the men. But then something really bad happened. Jack screamed in pain because one of the junkies had stabbed him with a rusty needle. That's when we decided to run. Me and Logan carried Jack while Marcus started the car, and the men didn't even bother chasing us. They just stared at us with emotionless looks as we got into the car. But, as we drove away, I looked behind and those twisted fuckers started laughing. First thing we did is got Jack to the local hospital, and luckily we did because the doctor told us Jack was suffering from tetanus and moderate trauma to the abdomen. But with the amazing service that is the NHS, Jack was back and healthy within a week. But he did have to get therapy for a while to help cope with the experience. We got word that the police found the people who tried to attack us, and apparently they were meth heads who were crazy, patriotic, and were convinced that me, Logan, Marcus, and Jack were Russian intelligence trying to infiltrate the government and some other crazy nonsense. But now they're locked away for a long time, so I'm not that worried. One thing for certain, I'm never going camping again. Number 3. A couple of days ago, I went camping alone, and I saw, heard, and experienced something that will stay with me until I die. I'm 22, graduated from high school, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I have a good job, good friends, and I have my life together and things are good. One day I decided to go camping deep in the woods that surround the town with my best friend. We were all set up until a few days beforehand. We had a family emergency. I was still intent on going, so I said, "Screw it, I'll go alone." I had the camping necessities all packed up and ready: a combat knife, a lighter, water purifier, a hatchet for collecting firewood, and a rifle and handgun in case I had to defend myself. In case anyone noticed anything about what I'm about to tell you, and piece anything together that I can't, I won't leave anything out. I woke up at 4 a.m., got breakfast, and started the long drive to a good campsite I heard from a friend. 2 hours later, I finally arrived. It was just like you described: peaceful, abundant with wildlife, and a view of the mountains and lake where you can see animals getting a drink. I set up the tent, collected some firewood, and sat down to admire the wildlife. After a while, I grabbed my backpack and started on a trail that goes around the lake. 10 minutes into my walk, something was off. I had a feeling that someone was watching me. As soon as I got that feeling, I noticed that the woods have gone silent. No birds, nothing. It was completely dead. I got uneasy and I was suddenly on high alert and paranoid. I turned around and speed walked back to my camp, my hand hovering over my handgun. I brushed it off as me being not used to being alone so far from civilization. I fell asleep rather fast, but late at night I woke up to an awful, inhuman, blood-curdling howl that petrified me to the bone. I put my shoes on and burst out of the tent, rifle in hand. After scanning the immediate area, I stopped to think and realize what happened. I needed to know what made that god-awful noise. A wolf? No, I've heard a wolf howl before. If anything, it's a peaceful bear. Possible, but I doubt a bear could even do that. Some crackhead psychopath? No human could never do that, ever. I said to myself, fuck that, and immediately started packing up. 5 minutes into packing, it happened again. The first time it sounded like it was on the other side of the lake, but now it was closer. This only gave me the kick in the ass I needed to speed up the process. After I finished, my heart sank. In the woods, a couple ways away, I heard running, something that was running at me. As soon as I knew, without hesitation, I fired a round at the thing. It must have missed because it didn't stop. I fired another round, and it must have made contact because it sounded like it tumbled to the dirt and roared in pain. I got into my truck and I peeled out of there all the way home. I'm lucky I didn't get pulled over. I don't know who or what was there, but all I know is that I'll never forget that roar. It's something that will echo in my mind forever. Number 4. Okay, so right now I hiked a long trail in Vermont 3 days ago. It was just a fun idea at first. I had some time off work, so I was going out in the cold winter wilderness. Seemed like a great idea, just to get me out of my house and hopefully persuade me to work out more. About 3 days ago, I drove to the entrance of the trail, parked my truck, registered my name with the office at the front of the trail. I grabbed my massive backpack and my cameras and set off on this long trip, completely unaware of what was going to happen. For the first few hours, I was incredibly excited, just looking up at all the leafless trees and calm forest streams, occasionally stopping to take a picture of wildlife and cool creations that nature seemed to make. There wasn't a soul in sight, and I wasn't surprised. It's December, and the temperature regularly drops below zero. I was the only one out here because I was the only one willing to carry the extra equipment to hike and camp in the freezing temperatures. I had been hiking for about 3 and a bit hours, and it was around 2 in the afternoon, and I had planned to ensure that I set up camp before 4:30, as I didn't want to be looking for a place to sleep in the dark. Despite my big size, I'm still embarrassingly scared of being alone in the dark. The only downside to camping alone was exactly that. When my watch beeped 4 p.m., I decided it was time to search for a place to set up camp for the night. I was not going to stay in a designated camping zone. I was hoping to be alone for this trip. Despite my fear, and even though I was almost certain no one would be at the camping ground, I wasn't taking the risk. So I found a small clearing near the stream, surrounded by tall trees on each side, and I began to unpack, pitch my one-man tent, and gather firewood. After I'd gotten the fire started, it was beyond dark, so I decided to sit by the fire for a while reading and listening to podcasts I had downloaded on my phone for the journey. Nothing happened for around 3 hours. As I just read with my hands as close to the fire as possible to keep them warm, it finally reached 7:30, so I decided I should get into the tent and get some sleep because it was getting below freezing and I needed to stay warm. I crawled into my small tent and got into my warm sleeping bag and took out my bright reading light and continued to read for another 30 minutes or so. It was great. I was doing what I love to do, on my own, in the middle of the brisk, desolated woods of Vermont, and despite what I feared, I was not scared of the dark, and when I could, I enjoyed looking into the tree line lit up in a warm orange by the campfire. At 9 p.m., it was time to sleep. I was tired and very satisfied with my journey so far, so I turned out my light, chucked some wood in the fire, and shut my eyes, and that's when it turned to shit. After rolling around in my sleeping bag for about 20 minutes, my fears became more potent. I perceived every sound from the forest as a sound of someone walking around the tree line, watching me, knowing that I couldn't see them. I mainly got rid of this fear by telling myself that it was impossible, that I hadn't seen anyone all day. So why would I see someone in the middle of the night and off the trail that everyone hiked on? But after fighting myself in my head, I heard a series of loud noises, of leaves being crunched, and this was much more real than the sound I was scared of before. I heard it continuously for about 20 seconds, and I was terrified. What was the sound? Was somebody outside? I heard these footsteps getting slower, but closer at the same time. I was completely silent. As the now slow footsteps inched closer to my tent, I'd probably say that I didn't have any weapons, aside from the axe I carried to help me chop firewood. As the sound got closer, I got closer and closer to running away in fear and dread. I saw the shadow of a human figure hit my tent from the light of the fire, and as the shadow got bigger and a metallic object ran along the side of my tent, I stopped breathing, my heart stopped beating, and my body shut down. I was terrified. I took a deep breath and climbed out of my sleeping bag and started hitting the side of my tent with the axe, and I screamed relentlessly, not stopping, just constant screaming. Get away from me, get away, run. I have an axe, please, just go. What's the point? Just leave. The figure got smaller, and over the sound of my bloody screams, I could hear the sound of fast-paced footsteps running away from the tent into the forest, out of sight. I remained sat up for hours, on edge the entire time, crying to myself. I had no signal, no radio, no contact with the outside world. What could I do but be scared? I was awake in my tent until the first peak of daylight, where I packed all of my stuff and ran for about 20 minutes until I became exhausted. I hadn't eaten, slept, or tried to calm down for hours. I couldn't go on for much longer, but every second I stood still, I felt like I was being watched from the distance, behind a tree, below a bush, in the stream. It didn't matter, I was not going to stop. I spent hours walking as fast as I could, but after walking for more than 6 hours, I could see the entrance to the trail. I sprinted with every ounce of energy I had to the office at the front. I cried to the staff member about being followed and attacked. I broke down completely. I fell to the floor in tears. The staff called the rangers who came to take a report from me, comforted me, and they said they send rangers to where I was camping. A ranger drove me home. I said I'd pick up my truck tomorrow, and that I just needed to get home for now, and that before I could go back to my car, I needed to get the fear out of my mind that someone at the trail was waiting for me. When I was dropped at home, I thanked the ranger and gave him $20, but he said he wasn't allowed to take it. I entered my apartment and sat on my couch, and I just sighed. What was I supposed to do at this point? I tried to carry on with the rest of my day as usual, as hard as that was, and that night. I had a horrible time sleeping. I had horrible dreams that the person who found me in the woods broke into my apartment and held me down in the bed as he tried to scare me as much as possible. The next morning I called the rangers and told them I was going to get a cab to the trail to pick up my car, and they told me that they would pick me up as they had caught a potential suspect. I was picked up by the same rangers the day before who drove me to the entrance trail and took me to the employees area of the camp office. He showed me a picture of a skinny old man and asked me if that was who I saw, and I explained I didn't actually see anyone. I only saw their shadow and a knife or some other weapon being pressed against my tent. The rangers said that they'd found the man where I'd been camping the day before, and that he was found wrapping metal wire between trees on the trail where I'd camped, probably so I'd trip up and he could get me. I actually cried when I heard this. It genuinely scared me what this person was trying to do to me. After I gave the rangers some more information, I drove home in my car, and have spent the time since trying to recover. What have I learned from this trip? That is, when you go camping, be prepared and always camp on the trail, for the possibilities, if you do not, are extreme and could change how you see nature for the rest of your life. Number 5. About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out from Tacoma into Mount Rainier, a place my own dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy of the wilderness as I had, but I'm quite convinced that he'll be terrified of the forest for the rest of his life. When we arrived that Friday, the weather was crisp and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked for about 2, maybe 3 hours from the parking lot into a small, desolate camping ground with pre-made fire pits. I'm not a very overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around a bit while I pitched the tent. Just as I was about done, he was getting ready to unload our 3-day supply into the tent. I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now, I recognize these sounds immediately, as they are the sounds he usually makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and saw him sitting in the grass about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. More strangely, he was doing this thing he does when he's particularly excited about something, in which he's slapping both of his thighs repeatedly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the wood at the same time, but there was nothing in the tree line I could make out. When I finally sat by his side and asked him what he had seen, this was his response. "Monkey man, monkey man." He was smiling, still slapping his thighs, and as much as I tried to match his excitement like a good parent should do, suddenly the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I fixed my eyes on the tree line and peered in very, very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked David up, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to frighten him. I mention this because a sensible thing might have been to hush him and tell him to keep quiet for a little bit. But then, I also knew that realistically, this was just an imaginative manifestation. After a few minutes of scouting around with David up on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I think, and so I made us some lunch, still keeping an occasional eye on the space at which David had been clapping and yapping just a few minutes prior. As much as I tried to forget it, I couldn't. I'm not superstitious, and I don't believe in aliens, ghosts, or Bigfoots, but I suppose my paternal instinct was simply in too much of high gear for me to let it go. So as the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit about what he had seen. To understand my story a little better, it might be relevant to mention here that David has a mild learning disability, which has particularly impaired his speech. He can understand fine, but his ability to communicate has lagged behind somewhat. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked if it was a big monkey man. David thought for about a second, then he laughed and nodded. I then asked if it seemed like a nice monkey man, and David once again giggled in approval. I wasn't really sure what else to ask. Nightfall struck, and on full bellies I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out to feel David, and panic struck me hard. He wasn't in the tent anymore. With only my underwear on, I stormed out, but realized it was too dark to see anything, so I dropped into my tent, grabbed my flashlight. I was screaming his name all at the same time. With only the weak beam of flashlight I didn't think I would ever have to actually rely on, I shone it around in circles, still calling for David. For some reason I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime, and I shouted his name into the trees. As I trotted inwards in the pitch-black woods, I was too frantic to notice how badly my feet were getting scraped up by the bark and stone. After only about a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight and bolt forward. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, utterly still. I grabbed onto him hard and began to sob, still clutching him tightly. I picked up the flashlight again, which had been idly beaming on the ground, and scouted around, feeding off the darkness. I could see nothing around. As I carried him back over my shoulder, I asked him what had happened. He implied that he didn't know and that he was tired. David had a long history of sleepwalking. That night I locked up the tent from the inside with a padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest, while David slept like a rock, despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I cooked some eggs and bacon on the camping stove. David had no recollection of what happened, and seemed content to continue the trip. I thought it would be incautious to shrug off last night's events as merely sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business, but also thought it would be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over it. Thus, I made a promise to myself that if anything else were to happen, we would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice and helped me take my mind off of things. David was at first a little upset about not having his iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them and set them downstream, watched squirrels and listened to the birds. It was everything I had hoped the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day in the tent. I had brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with an electrode, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound. I don't remember what it's called, but David found it hilarious. It's dumb, but supposedly helps with motor development. At one of David's turns, he made an error and the little speaker made the sound again, and David bellowed in laughter. What happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything will ever match. From about 150 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David had made, only that it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking, then digitally pitch it down. I froze, and this time, I couldn't hide my reaction from David. I could tell by his face that he had heard it too. I lifted a finger up to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I also noticed that the sun had set completely. I also noticed just how dead quiet the woods were. Every second felt like an eternal minute as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, enveloped in the silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears finally ceased a little, I slowly leaned over towards my backpack to get my handgun out. When I turned around to face David again, I saw that he had picked up the electrodes. I sternly removed it from his hand and whispered with equal sternness, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a low, broken voice whispered, literally inches from the tent, "Not now, David." The next thing I'm aware of is that I'm shooting wildly through the fabric of the tent in the direction of the sound. David is screaming, and as the gunshots ring through the woods, I hear the last remnants of something sprinting away. With my hand violently trembling, I opened the padlock and jumped out with the flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into black nothingness. I grabbed David, stuffed everything within arm's reach into the backpack, and ran. The way back was pure terror. There was not a second at which I did not feel as if something was right behind us, ready to leap out from behind us or at the side of the trail, from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David was, "It's okay, you'll get your iPad soon. Do you want your iPad?" Nothing ever leaped out at us, nor did I hear anything except for the rushing of the wind and the occasional running stream by the trail side. I was so out of it that even in the car I kept checking the back seat just to see if there was something sitting in it ready to destroy us. I don't know how to explain to David's pediatrician what happened at Mount Rainier. I haven't even told his mother the full story, only that I thought someone came up to our tent and that I fired a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He has been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears from the gunshots. But I don't really know how to end this story, but one thing is for certain. Never take your kids out to Mount Rainier National Park. I hope you enjoyed the previous stories. This is our regular upload schedule, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and our international series on Thursdays. So please subscribe and like the videos so we can continue bringing you further horror content to your enjoyment. Thank you. Have a great day.